Nasvania, scientists compared the DNA of every Native American tribe. The results rewrote history. Sitsanari. Imagine a map of North America with every tribal nation colored in as if they were all genetically the same. One shade covering an entire continent, as if a Navajo family in Arizona and a Mi'kmaq family on the Atlantic coast were biologically interchangeable. That map exists. It's been printed in textbooks, hung in classrooms, and repeated in documentaries for over a century. It is also, according to the actual DNA, almost completely wrong. Scientists spent years collecting genetic samples, with full consent and in careful partnership with participating tribal nations, comparing populations across the entire hemisphere, from the Arctic Circle to the southern tip of Chile. They mapped hundreds of distinct indigenous populations against each other, looking at deep ancestral lineages, migration timing, and genetic relationships that had never been directly compared at this scale before. What the data revealed was not one continent of closely related people. It was something closer to dozens of separate ancient nations, some more genetically distant from each other than certain European populations are from populations in East Asia. Before we get into what the comparison actually found, if you're the kind of person who wants the real, researched history behind these numbers, hit subscribe. This channel investigates exactly this every week. Now let's look at what the data actually showed. The first and most fundamental finding confirms something indigenous oral histories and linguists had argued for generations, against significant resistance from earlier generations of anthropologists. There was never one single wave of migration that populated two entire continents. Genetic evidence now supports at least 3, and possibly more, distinct migration events into the Americas, each bringing genetically distinguishable founding populations, arriving at different times, likely along different routes, over a span of thousands of years. The earliest and largest wave, ancestral to the vast majority of indigenous populations across North, Central, and South America, is believed to have crossed from Siberia sometime between 15 and 20,000 years ago, either across the exposed land bridge of Beringia or along the coastal kelp highway route, hugging the retreating ice sheets. This founding population then split repeatedly as descendants spread south and east, each split creating a genetically distinguishable branch, the ancestors of what would eventually become hundreds of separate nations, each isolated enough by distance and time to accumulate their own distinct genetic signature. A second genetically distinct wave contributed ancestry primarily to populations across the Arctic and subarctic, most notably the ancestors of Inuit, Yupik, and related northern populations, arriving significantly later than the initial founding migration and carrying genetic markers that trace more directly to more recent Siberian populations, rather than the earlier Beringian founders. A third and genuinely startling thread in the data involves the Nadine language family, spoken by peoples ranging from Athabascan groups in the far north of Canada and Alaska, down to the Navajo and Apache nations of the American Southwest, a linguistic connection spanning literally thousands of miles. Genetic analysis confirms this isn't coincidence. Nadine-speaking populations carry a distinct, traceable genetic signature connecting northern and southern branches, physical evidence of one of the longest confirmed indigenous migrations documented anywhere on the continent. Beyond these founding migration waves, the comparison revealed something equally important: the sheer degree of genetic differentiation that developed between populations once they settled into distinct, often geographically isolated regions. Populations in the Amazon basin, for instance, show genetic markers connecting them to ancient migration patterns that some researchers believe may include a contribution from populations related to indigenous peoples of Australia and Papua New Guinea, an unexpected and still actively debated finding that suggests the story of how humans reached the Americas may be more complex than a single clean migration route. Populations along the Pacific Northwest coast, meanwhile, show genetic continuity with extremely deep roots, some of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in the Americas, supporting the coastal kelp highway migration theory, a route that would have allowed people to move south along the coastline far faster than an inland ice-free corridor route would have permitted, potentially explaining archaeological sites like the human footprints preserved at White Sands, New Mexico, that date to 21,000 to 23,000 years ago, older than the traditional Clovis-first migration model ever accounted for. Regional comparisons reveal just how much genetic distance can accumulate between neighboring nations once enough time and geographic separation come into play. Researchers comparing populations across the Great Basin, the same region tied to the ancestral roots of the Comanche and Shoshone, found genetic differentiation between communities separated by only a few hundred miles that rivaled differentiation seen across entire European countries. This wasn't expected. Earlier models assumed that populations connected by trade routes, seasonal migration, and intermarriage would show comparatively blended, homogeneous genetic profiles. Instead, the data showed sharp, measurable boundaries in specific cases, evidence that even populations in regular contact maintained distinct genetic identities over long stretches of time, likely reinforced by specific marriage practices and community structures that many of these nations still describe in their own oral histories today. The comparison also settled, or at least significantly clarified, a long-running scientific debate about the so-called Clovis-first model, the once dominant theory that a single culture, identified by a distinctive style of stone spear point, first found near Clovis, New Mexico, represented the original and earliest population of the Americas, with all later indigenous nations descending directly from that single founding culture. Genetic evidence gathered across dozens of populations increasingly complicates this picture. Some ancient genomes recovered from sites both older than and geographically distant from classic Clovis sites show genetic signatures that don't fit neatly into a single origin model, supporting the idea that multiple related but distinguishable founding populations may have entered the continent at slightly different times through more than one route, rather than a single wave spreading uniformly outward from one point of entry. What emerges from placing every available population side by side is not a single genetic story, but dozens of them, layered, overlapping in places, sharply distinct in others. Southeastern nations, shaped by the collapse of massive Mississippian mound-building civilizations like Cahokia, show genetic continuity connecting them to those earlier, now-vanished urban centers. Great Plains nations, many of whom underwent their own dramatic and relatively recent migrations, some moving hundreds of miles within just the last few centuries, following the spread of horses after European contact, show genetic signatures that reflect those documented, comparatively recent movements. Southwest nations, including the descendants of ancestral Puebloan populations, show deep genetic continuity stretching back thousands of years in one specific region, layered against later arrivals like the Nardane-speaking peoples who arrived from the far north. The comparison also directly and repeatedly disproves one of the most persistent and damaging myths in the history of American anthropology. The idea, popular among 19th-century racial scientists and still lingering in some popular assumptions today, that all indigenous peoples of the Americas were, or are, one broadly uniform genetic population. The data shows precisely the opposite. Genetic diversity between different indigenous nations of the Americas can, in specific comparisons, exceed the level of genetic diversity found across entire European populations, a direct and measurable rebuttal to over a century of flattening, homogenizing assumption. This finding carries real weight beyond pure scientific curiosity. For generations, government policy, museum collection practices, and academic research alike frequently treated indigenous nations as interchangeable, a single undifferentiated category, rather than hundreds of distinct sovereign nations, each with their own history, language, and identity. The genetic evidence, gathered specifically in careful partnership with participating nations rather than imposed on them, provides hard scientific confirmation of what those nations had always maintained about their own distinctiveness, that they were never one people, but many, each with a documented, traceable, and genuinely unique history. The comparison also revealed something researchers describe as genuinely humbling about the limits of the current data itself. Genetic sampling across indigenous nations remains even now deeply uneven. Some nations, largely due to decades of active, consent-based partnership between tribal governments and specific research institutions, are represented by dozens or even hundreds of sequenced genomes. Others, often due to a completely understandable and justified historical distrust of outside researchers, following generations of extractive, non-consensual sample collection, remain represented by only a handful of samples, or in some documented cases, none at all. This means the map of indigenous American genetic diversity that exists today, as detailed and revealing as it already is, almost certainly understates the true scope of that diversity. Every nation that has chosen, for entirely valid reasons rooted in a painful history, not to participate in genetic research represents a gap in the data, not evidence that their population history is somehow less distinct or less significant than the nations that are represented. It's worth being precise about what this kind of comparison can and cannot responsibly tell us. It cannot rank populations by any measure of purity, age, or authenticity, a framing that responsible researchers explicitly and repeatedly reject. It cannot determine tribal citizenship. That authority belongs entirely to each individual nation. What it can do, and what it has done here, is provide a genuinely new, evidence-based layer of understanding to add alongside oral history, linguistics, and archaeology. 3 lines of evidence that in case after case, this genetic data has confirmed rather than contradicted. If you've taken a consumer DNA test yourself and are looking at a broad category like Indigenous Americas or Native American without much further detail, this is exactly why. Most commercial tests are built to sort ancestry into wide continental categories, not the kind of specific nation-level distinction that research like this is only now beginning to map. Understanding what your own percentages and haplogroups can and genuinely cannot tell you is exactly what I put together a 24-page guide to explain, including why siblings so often get different results from identical parents. The link is in the description with a 7-day money-back guarantee. Comment the number that surprised you most. 1. That at least 3 separate migration waves populated the Americas. 2. The 3,000-mile Nadine connection linking the Arctic to the American Southwest. 3. The possible ancient genetic link between Amazonian populations and Oceania. 4. The 21,000-year-old white sands footprints challenging the traditional migration timeline. Or 5. The finding that genetic diversity between indigenous nations can exceed diversity across all of Europe. In the next video, we look at 7 physical traits that genetic researchers have connected to indigenous American ancestry, and what the actual science says about each one, separating the traits with real genetic backing from the ones that are little more than family legend.